welcome to Paddy and Clare today. It's great to have you with us. I think we're actually just going to delve straight in, if that's okay. So Claire, do you want to tell us what happened with your pregnancy with Callum?
Yeah, so everything had been normal. We'd had our 12-week scan, that was fine. Going into our 20-week scan, again, everything was fine. Went into the room, we're having the scan. Everything again seemed sort of fine, and then there was a pause, and we both sort of kind of looked at each other and thought, what's going on? And yeah, she basically sort of said that there was some what looked like sort of default in his heart, and it would need sort of further investigation. So then we were referred to the JR in Oxford and had sort of further tests. And he was diagnosed with, his heart was basically not sort of growing as it should, and the valves were not sort of in the right place. And
aorta was narrowed, wasn't it?
So what was the advice given to you?
I think we were to go back for sort of more scans and more checks, and just to see if there was any improvement, just to sort of wait for a bit. I can't remember how many scans we had after that point. It was quite a few, and quite a few appointments at the JR, and things weren't improving. Yeah, this was now kind of, mid sort of, 24 weeks we were at or so, and things weren't sort of getting any better. Part of it was then that they came back and said there's not really much we can do, and they basically said they're looking at the sort of termination for medical reasons.
That's obviously a really difficult decision to have to make. How did you go about making that decision?
Yeah, I think with a lot of tears, a lot of questions. As people of faith and as a Christian pastor at the time, you've had an ethic always that this life was designed by God. It was a life that we wanted, a baby that we loved. Doctors, when they reached the point where they said there was no surgical option, did move quite quickly to saying, termination is better for Callum, that he would begin to struggle in various ways. But we held off, prayed, asked people to pray. We waited as long as we could. We talked that sort of the moment where it began to affect Claire would be a moment where we'd have to then think more deeply. So we kind of waited, but there was a point where Claire's own health began to just show signs that the doctors were a bit concerned about. Callum had begun to sort of deteriorate in his own health, which was then. So at that point, you go through talking about a process that I guess we'd never even considered before, and which we know is, whoever's making that decision, it must always be a painful thing. But especially in our case, where we'd had one son, this was another boy that we wanted, giving him a name, and had a future plan. So it was advice from doctors, advice from family and friends, advice from people in church, but ultimately we made the decision.
So I'll stay with you for a minute, Paddy. Can you describe your journey in grief, if you like, up till now? What does that look like over the years? Because how many years ago was it that Callum was born?
14
now, yeah. So I'd say what I've learned through it in my own walk is that everyone's grief is unique. So even others that have maybe walked this path, when you speak to them, it's important not to kind of go, I know exactly how you feel. And actually, Claire and I, we grieve in different ways anyway. I definitely had a lot of anger. I think anger is a part of grief which is common, and anger at the world, for a bit at God. You have people who are praying, and you sort of think, well, God, if you did this, surely the hospital would see that. And sadness, I'm someone who processes it internally, so I didn't find speaking about it helpful. That's not to say you shouldn't, and I think I'm not saying it's a healthy thing I do, but what I would find is when I was speaking about it, and even now, you kind of relive it. Whereas I think for others, it helps them to move on. I think for me, it often feels like I'm just sort of back there. Read some books, sort of took myself off kind of quietly. I found some real help in the Book of Lamentations in the Bible. So I think up to then, I had this sort of childish faith where you sort of think, well, if I believe in God, things are going to go okay. If I'm good, things are going to be fine, like God's this insurance policy. And I think lots of people have that idea of God. And yet when you read scripture, some things that were helpful for me was, so God is someone who knows what it's like to lose a son. In Lamentations and in the lament Psalms, people like David cry out to God with feelings that are not true, but are what they feel. So God, you've abandoned me. God, you're not here. God, you've left me alone. But there's a permission to do that, and God's big enough to let you do that. And for me, that was really helpful in my anger and sadness. C.S. Lewis's book, Shadowlands, about the loss of his wife, and the sort of isolation that causes and the questions. It's definitely been a journey, and what I used to think was that grief would shrink over time. But what I think now is that your grief stays the same and just life grows around it. So in comparison to your life, your grief may seem smaller, but the minute you look back at it, it's exactly the same.
That's quite a helpful way to look at it. And Claire, can I ask you the same question? How has that sort of journey of grief been for you so far?
Yeah, I think back in the time, Paddy's briefly mentioned it already, we are different in the way, and everybody is different in the way they grieve. But we're sort of very different. He's touched on it already, that he's more sort of internally processes things. I'm more sort of external, kind of process it, talk it through. Yeah, so at the time it was kind of disbelief, I guess, to start with. Are we going through this? Is this really happening to us? Why is it happening? We had all those questions. I remember we had lots of kind of evenings, just sort of, crying together, praying together, going through the Bible together, speaking to family on the phone, having church or people come round as well. I think that there was anger as well in that. I think also sort of going further along, kind of, we felt kind of that, although we had people around, and we did have people around, and church and friends and family, I think sort of understanding, I guess, sort of medical side of things and having support from people like that. I've come across now Tommy's, who are a great charity in supporting families that go through miscarriages, infertility sort of issues and stuff, and they are a great support to people and do lots of research. And I think for me, it would have been nice, I guess, to have known about them at that time and to sort of hit into their sort of resources and stuff. And in the last sort of 6 months, I've done a marathon for them, and I think that's sort of part of the journey as well for me, that I've raised money for them. I did the London Marathon in October.
I think you mentioned to me before that there wasn't a lot of information on going through making a decision of a termination on medical grounds. Do Tommy's help with that at all? They
have got a bit on that, I think. Everybody's unique and different in each sort of situation. And I think in the last sort of couple of years, I think Tommy's have started this sort of national awareness of termination for medical reasons. And they have a day set aside, like a number of different days that they have. So they're trying to get it out there. It's one of those not spoken about subjects. Miscarriage is there. And again, that's not spoken about much, but there's lots of kind of information about that. Infertility as well. Termination for medical reasons isn't about there.
It's difficult in church as well, because we're aware in the Christian world that there's a range of views on it, and so even like recently in America, where they were talking about getting rid of termination, even in the kind of medical cases where mothers' lives are at risk, and aware that different believers need to make up their own minds about it, but have found it was interesting that discussion brought up quite a lot of anger in me, in that sense of this was not something we wanted. Not something you're choosing, not something that's easy. And I guess, being aware of that in churches, that as you speak to people, that can be difficult too. So, I think encouraging church people to be sensitive to each other and gentle, is important. But, it can make those conversations really hard.
I hope you don't mind me going back to those early days after you lost Callum. What was helpful, if somebody's trying to support somebody going through something like that, what was helpful, maybe what was unhelpful in the support you were shown?
For me, just knowing that people were there. I remember Neil coming round sort of one evening, one afternoon, walked in, didn't say anything, and just hugged us both. And that was really kind of powerful, and just it was saying, I'm here. I don't really have the answers. I don't kind of really know what to say, but I'm here. I'm here to support, and I'm, walking with you. And I really remember that, him sort of coming in. When you're in that kind of bubble and in that time, you perhaps don't sort of think of the bigger world, and you don't realise that other people have been through this. And so I remember getting cards from friends, family, church members, and a number of them had, we've been through similar, sending you lots of sort of love and support. And that was nice to have. And, I think we had meals, didn't we? We had sort of people coming around just to pray, and our sort of closest friends would just message us or just call us up and just say, hey, just thinking of you. If you want to chat, where we are. And we sort of, it was gradual sort of going through that.
And we were blessed in that we had Zach, a healthy, kid, and so life kind of continues with that. I guess some practical things. With some grief, there is nothing that can be said, and yet often people try. And so I remember, you sort of hear things like, God's doing this for a reason, I think is never helpful to say. You might learn something new about God as you go through grief, but I'm not sure about the theology of, God has done this to teach you something. So I'd avoid that. I think helpful things to say to someone is, look, I can't imagine what you're feeling. I care. How can I help?
To actually ask that
to
question.
actually ask the question and to acknowledge a sense of, what would be helpful today. I think the really difficult thing with grief is that, for example, like Neil coming and being quiet was helpful that moment. The next day, it may not have been, and it's not Neil's fault.
I think one thing I've sort of learned over the years and listening to Paddy as well is that question of not how are you doing, it's how are you doing today? And because every day is different, every sort of day you come to, things could be fine and you just crack on. Some days you just could be in pieces. And I think that is a really good way of asking someone and then just listening to what their response is.
One of the things lots of people talk about with grief is their world will never be the same, and yet everyone else's seems to just carry on. And that can be the most painful thing. The first 3 weeks tend to be quite a time where you've got the funeral coming, you've got things to plan. And it's often post-funerals where suddenly the emptiness hits. I definitely think, for me, learning about a God who was bigger than I thought was also, from a grief perspective, really helpful. I'd never want to go through it to learn that, but a God who I can be sad and angry at, and who is gracious enough to take that. In the book of Job, there's a bit where bad things happen to someone who doesn't deserve it. And it's interesting because you sort of get Proverbs, which basically says, live well, life will go well. But that didn't happen. And then you get Job, where it's like, this guy lived well and things didn't go well. And then you get Ecclesiastes, where it's like, well, what's life about then? And I think I found that a really helpful way of thinking about faith, that God's answer to Job at the end of that suffering is not to explain it neatly. He says, Job, if you were there when I created the world, if you'd seen the things I'd seen, if you knew the things I knew, you would ask a different question. But he doesn't say it in a mean way. It's in that loving way of a God who knows all things. And, I sort of feel like in my head, I'm going to stand before God and say, God, why did that happen? But I do honestly believe that when I get to that moment, there'll be a million other questions that would be far better to ask. And as Christians, the hope is that death's not the end. So there's a verse that we put on Callum's grave that says, he gathers the lambs in his arms, and I trust a God who wept at gravesides, who cared about the death of children, a God who has experienced that. This is not just a sort of, I have faith that it's going to turn out okay. You're trusting in someone who's walked those paths, and that's a comfort.
So key dates must be hard. Is there anything particular that you do?
Well, we've got the grave, and we try and come up on the date of his birth, and we all come, family of 5 now, and we all come up, bring a bunch of flowers, and we each sort of put flowers in one at a time, just remembering him, talking about him. Kids ask some questions, and then we'll have a sort of prayer, won't we? So we all come up when we can on that.
And it's funny, and it's not funny, but that's something I find hard. I know Claire does as well, but you often be like, let's go, and it's that kind of thing. But it's helpful when you're there, and we do pray and sort of read the verse together. It's on his gravestone and stuff. But it's funny. Part of me wishes that's something that, in one sense, came easy. There was a nice quote I read, which is like, grief is the price we pay for love. And so actually the fact that it's hard and that grief still feels deep is a nice sort of kind of measure, even, and we're aware our grief is much more a grief of what could have been.
Yes.
Others have had, years with people, months with people, days with people, and ours, is a grief of, a life that we'd have loved to have seen, but, still remarkably deep,
Losing a child can put an awful amount of strain, can't it, on a marriage? You've kind of talked a little bit about how you've each coped individually. Is there any advice you'd give?
I think for me, the one thing that I'd say to any couple is that there's no right or wrong way to grieve. So part of the strain often is if we sort of think, well, they should be acting like this. Why are they not crying more? Why are they not, but knowing that grief is unique and that different days are unique can be helpful.
It's understanding each other as well. I want to sort of go through things and, I'll cry about it. Yeah, those sort of things. And Paddy understands that and he sees the signs, when I'm sort of thinking and going through that. I also understand that Paddy doesn't like talking loads and he processes things internally. It's that understanding of he's doing his grief that way, and that is his way of dealing with it. My way isn't his way, and his way isn't my way.
One of the things as well, there has been a helpful talk about mental health and griefs attached to that. This thing about just talk about it, talk to a mate. Actually, not every mate is helpful to talk to. Not every person is helpful to talk to. And even within churches, there are some people who either maybe haven't experienced grief themselves or maybe have slightly, unhelpful views of things. So speaking to wise, helpful counsellors, people that you sort of value and trust their wisdom more generally, giving each other permission to be angry and sad. It is, there are some people I've met who, why aren't I better now? Right. And I don't see grief as something you need to be healed from. I don't think grief is something you come through. I think grief is something you walk in. I would say to anyone though, funerals are really important. If you can have it. I've met a lot of families through my work as a minister where they've not had that moment, and sometimes by choice and because they're trying to hold grief at arm's length, but a moment to confront the reality of death, to try and hear some words of hope. But as a couple, I think it's, just being gentle, and the hard work of being a couple is saying, I don't feel like doing that for you today, but because I love you, I'm going to do that for you.
Well, thank you ever so much, both of you, for being so open and honest and sharing with us today. So really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thanks,
no problem. No, thank you.